We tend to talk about sexual integrity too late, and we are way too many years deep in the age of social media and the internet not to talk about these things early. My guest, Crystal Renaud-Day, is here to talk with us about navigating social media use with integrity in our sexuality. She's here to talk as a woman, as a wife, and she's here as somebody who has instructed parents on how to help their children navigate the internet, this place where we can work, we can be creative, we can research. But she's not shy about the pitfalls that await many of us when we are exposed to the dark corners of the internet that seem to want to work themselves into every social media platform and every website, innocuous as they may seem, and how to operate in this online age well and with integrity. Given the content of this episode, we will be talking about pornography, we'll be talking about sexuality, and so this episode may not be appropriate for young listeners. So moms, if you've got littles in the room, you might want to send them out. Thanks. Crystal, thank you for joining us today. I am so excited to sit with you and talk to you a bit about your story.
You're welcome, Jillian. I'm excited to be with you guys, or with you and everyone listening.
Tell me a bit about your story and how She Recovery even came to be.
For about a decade in my adolescence, I lived with a struggle with pornography and other unwanted sexual behaviors. And until I was in recovery, no one knew about it. So what's important about my story, I think that for parents to hear and for women who are struggling to hear, is that it's not something that I went and looked for. Like, I wasn't seeking out pornography. I wasn't expecting to be bombarded by it either. I was exposed to pornography because I was only 10 years old. Has to be conditions favorable for being able to find it. And that exposure impacted me greatly. The distinction matters because women, and honestly many children, carry shame for something that they began doing because of exposure, curiosity, premature sexualization, rather than intentional pursuit. There comes an age of accountability, but a lot of the shame starts with something that we didn't seek out. And looking back, I can see that my very young brain and nervous system were introduced to something that, again, I wasn't prepared for. And it shaped me long before I understood what was happening inside of me at that time. I grew up in a Christian home, and so I often interpreted this struggle through the lens of shame and through the lens of I'm a bad Christian, like I'm a bad girl. And I kept believing that if I just tried harder or prayed harder or became more disciplined in my Bible study, that eventually I would overcome it. But underneath that behavior were much deeper emotional and relational dynamics that I didn't yet understand. And part of what made the struggle so isolating was that I couldn't find language for my experience as a female, because the conversations around pornography, around sexual addiction, were centered around men. It's the only conversations I had ever heard, and the examples felt more extreme than my story, or more external or more disconnected from my own experience. And so my struggle was much quieter, much more hidden, much more secretive, much more isolating. And it became connected to loneliness and emotional pain and fantasy and validation and escape and just trying to regulate what I was carrying internally. And for years, I genuinely believed that I was the only female in the world who struggled in this way, because that's what the conversations around me told me. What began changing for me in all of that was not first like a recovery strategy, but really it was about being known and being seen for the first time. And that's because another woman shared her story with me, an honest story of pornography and sexual struggles. And it was the first time I'd ever heard that from a female, and it was a Me Too moment, where it was the Me Too of that broke through years of shame and isolation. And that it was really that divine opportunity. I think she really felt the Holy Spirit nudge her to say, this girl needs to hear your story. So I do give her a lot of credit for where we are today, she and the Holy Spirit. And so that moment gave me language, finally, like, oh, I'm not the only one. Women do struggle. The struggle looks like this. And it gave me hope as well, that there was recovery available to me, that there was healing available for me. And so as I started to pursue recovery, I realized that sobriety and healing were not the same thing. And I could focus on behavior management and just stopping behavior without really addressing the deeper wounds, the coping patterns, the false belief systems, unmet needs, all of that. Be sober but not healed of all the things that were driving this behavior forward. And so that became a big turning point in my personal understanding, not only personally, but also eventually professionally as I pursued doing this work for a living. And so that brings us to She Recovery. I actually started this as an online community in 2009. But prior to that, I did it as a support group at my church, a little organization. It started as an online community. And it was created for women who are struggling with pornography and other unwanted sexual behaviors and addictions. And it's now She Recovery. And at the time I launched it, I would say, I like to say there was very few spaces, but there was no spaces for women who were struggling in this way. So it was the first of its kind that was specifically for women and pornography and sexual addiction. That didn't involve men, didn't involve betrayed wives. It was just for women. And what I began seeing immediately was just how many of these women were like me, who believed they were alone, they were struggling silently, and they felt much like they were beyond help because of that, which eventually led me to write Dirty Girls Come Clean, which was my first book. And again, that was also the first book ever written from the perspective of females who struggle with pornography. And since then, I have spent 15 plus years, just walking women through recovery, through coaching and counseling. I have a counselor.
The origin story here is very important because it is not an oft talked about issue, even as in terms of things that we recover from and do require a life overhaul from us. Porn recovery, especially in women. I mean, talk about the taboo of the taboos. I myself have not seen any group specific to women outside of She Recovery that deals specifically with this issue. In the beginning of your story, you talked about, I thought if I could just end one behavior, freedom would open up for me. And it's an interesting distinction there, isn't it? Because recovery, as you said, is different from, we're terming it sobriety, right? We're terming that as, almost some people might even, they discuss white knuckling it, right? So we can give up an iniquity, but the point of recovering and the freedom that Christ has to give us is that some people in recovery groups of different forms might say it rockets you into a fourth dimension of living. It's meant to be unto life abundantly. It is meant to be unto greater purpose and unto freeing up your being to be of maximum servitude to God. We instead are invited to lay down that which is sinful, which does detract from life abundantly, to pick up, yes, our cross, to pick up the labor of good living. But in that labor, what God stands to return to us, fruits promised from a life lived devotedly to Him, and sometimes to lay something down that is so secret and so difficult to talk about and so difficult to find support for. It's almost like I venture to guess for many women, it is like trying to find some sort of underground railroad of community, right? Because we don't recover alone. We rarely recover from our sin alone. And so not fully, certainly. You've provided a space for people to be able to recover together, to break free from the shame associated with the issue and really get to a place of solution. Shame being just kind of an unproductive agent of defeat in our lives, to say, what can we do? What can we, yes, remove from our lives, but also what can we become if we lay down the sin and we pick up life? I do want to talk about what this would look like in an age of social media. There's a huge performance structure in beating the algorithm and maintaining a presence. Especially, we watch shows like Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. We watch a lot of this mom talk content, and we're seeing that it's not entirely intellectually rich. It's showmanship, right? That constant performance starts to erode sexual integrity.
So social media, whether it is like the TikTok and the offshoots and all of, like, it seems like a lot of social media is then becoming like Hulu series, and like these people who we think we know we're now watching them as scripted reality, and it is performative. It's all performance. And I still think we have to recognize that, especially now, like girls, young women, they're being raised in a culture where identity is increasingly performed instead of formed. So we are pretending, we are being something that we're not because we think that somebody wants us to be that way or to look that way or act that way. So social media trains women our age or women younger to constantly monitor themselves through visibility, through attention, through approval, through likes, through comments, through hearts and all these things, and comparison especially. And so we learn very early to ask questions like, how do I look? Or am I desirable? Am I noticed? Am I enough? Even preparing for today, my hair looks really flat and weird. And I'm like, why does it look like that in this video when in the mirror it looked really full and luscious? And so I'm like, why does it look like that? And so I would even preparing for this, I'm like, I look so terrible. But that constant like self-presentation, it divides our identity and because worth begins to feel externally dependent on like that stimulus, that like attention and those likes and all of that. And so sexual wholeness becomes difficult in all of that because attention itself becomes rewarding. And so when that attention is sexual, then how are you going to be sexually whole? Because everything on social media is wear less, do more. And so it's the better you look, or the less you wear, or the more provocative you are, the sexier you dance, whatever it is gets you more attention. And so that is a reward for not being sexually whole.
It's interesting what you're describing with sexual wholeness, because I'm picturing a bridge between this wholeness and then a fragmentation that occurs the more exposure happens. This bridge between beauty and self-exhibitionism. Mm-hmm. As you continue to cross that bridge, you continue to fragment the self, right? If you continue to participate in these behaviors, you will divide like Horcruxes. And as that occurs, and then I do see these reports, especially on TikTok, especially these girls that wake up and they say, I've been groomed. I didn't realize what I was participating in, but it was borderline ritualistic as I kept training my algorithm. And then, like you said, as we were talking about your exposure to pornography, saying, and then I became increasingly exposed to a sort of sexual expectations, performative expectations. And I went from valuing beauty, something that's very important to us, especially as women, but when you trail off the path and you start to bridge from beauty to this sort of self-exhibitionism, and then you start to fragment the self, and then you start to say, well, what is contributing to me staying on this bridge and continuing to participate in that which is defeating me and that which I desperately want to wake up from? That's the position a lot of young women are in on social media, especially those who maybe do have a desire to be content creators, to be creative, and are wondering, what is my niche? Well, what do I currently have outside of skill sets, outside of perhaps expertise, especially teenagers, right?
Yeah.
Maybe they're not yet RNs getting online and saying, here's what to do when your kid chokes, right? They're trying to figure out what they stand to contribute to the public sphere on social media. And very often they are going to be shoved into this dark corner of the internet that wants them to sell what is most natural and precious to them. We've come to be exposed to these things because we're kind of shuffled into that part of
women from the very beginning have been reduced to what they look like and what they can offer with their body, unfortunately. And so that hasn't changed, and I think it's obviously gotten worse through the social media and just the constant, again, self-examination, this self-evaluation that is happening through it.
What do you think it does to a girl when she learns to evaluate her body through likes, comments, DMs, and comparison? Would you say that puts her in a higher risk category for sexually deviant behavior, for maybe a pornography exposure or addiction? Would you say that sort of elevates her, that social media use alone? Or would you say it's a type of social media use? It's a type of exposure. It's this list of behaviors that usually we see attached to somebody who then gets on that trajectory to having an issue with pornography?
I think it can go both ways. We did a survey at She Recovery a couple of years ago and of women who admitted to having been addicted to pornography or watching pornography or using it in some capacity in their lives. And we asked them, when were you first exposed to it? And nearly half were exposed before the age of 12, or actually about 80% were exposed before the age of 18. But the most exposure time was between ages of 8 and 12, and it was 46%.
What is
So
it
almost,
with that age range?
yeah,
How was it happening?
I think that's happening. Well, in my experience, I mean, I'm 41, so my experience was through a magazine in my brother's bathroom. So it wasn't that I had easy access to the internet through my phone like we would today. But I think part of what happens, I'm not a mom, but I train a lot of parents. What happens is that 8 to 12-year range, you start to give your kids more independence. Maybe they're home alone more, or maybe they're watching a sibling. And so I think there's just less hovering happening. And also they're starting to have sleepovers. They're starting to, kind of venture out into just finding out who they are a little bit. And so some of those exposures become easier because the parents aren't always watching what they're doing. And I think that's why that age range is so kind of critical for that formation in that time.
What are your opinions on sleepovers?
It's funny because I didn't have a lot of sleepovers growing up, mainly because I just have a lot of friends. I think that if there's risk involved, for sure. I think that, is it all bad? No, but I do think that parents need to be extraordinarily careful with where they're staying, who they're staying with, and do they know the parents? Are the parents going to be there? Like, you have to have that safety and those boundaries to understand, like, not every birthday party sleepover is a safe environment.
Yeah. I think for us, as we're evaluating this, once again, our oldest is very young. So we haven't entered into those questions yet. But it is almost, in our discussions so far, we thought, what do you need to accomplish at a sleepover that you can't accomplish by like 10:30 at night? So
Yeah.
I'm not saying anything horrible is going to happen.
I think that's a
I
fair
am confused until college, and my father's words still ring in my head. Why, Dad? Because nothing good happens after midnight. And you know what? He was right. I mean, I just think when you're around your friends for that long at that age, social boundaries start to wear. It doesn't mean anything necessarily dangerous is going to happen. It just, I don't know. I don't know that a kid needs to be around his friends that many hours at that age. So that's always an interesting thing. And then you do add the internet component in, and there's some sort of witching hour, I think, that does occur. And God bless my children, but not fully developed frontal lobes. Love them, love their friends, but
squishy little brains. Yeah,
just
they're
squishy. Just
they're not. Yeah.
needs a lot of oversight. I'm very curious as to the surveys you've done and the research you've done at how often does pornography exposure begin with apps that are innocuous enough, seemingly innocuous enough, like social media apps, DMs, influencers, Instagram reels, just scrolling through that, what that kind of makes up for, and how easily these young kids are targeted, or if they have to do a little bit of digging. Which app would you say is probably the worst for exposure?
Goodness. It changes, honestly, because app developers and what they're doing, every once in a while they start creating greater safeguards and more filtering. So there's some attempt to better these things, but if you were to ask the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, they have their Dirty Dozen list that they release every year. And that's a combination of places you shop or social media, different websites, different things. And TikTok is always on the list.
Shocker.
And so is X or Twitter. Because, yeah, I have been on X and and we've actually been trying to implore Elon Musk, like, you are just allowing anything on X. Like, X has true porn.
Yeah,
like you have porn stars with like, it's like OnlyFans accounts and stuff just posting their previews on X. Like, you can watch full pornography on X. TikTok actually is better about those things being flagged.
Right.
X doesn't flag them at all. Like, nothing at all. And so I would say X is probably the worst one.
X is the worst one. That's Interesting. What would you consider soft sexual content, and what's it teaching before the explicit pornography enters the picture?
So it depends on who you're asking. So children shouldn't be watching like Bridgerton, right? Because it's made for adult women. But a lot of people will give shows like Bridgerton a pass because it's simulated sex. It's not actually pornography, they're just acting. But she's fully nude and everything is shown, and there leaves very little to the imagination of what's going on there. And so I think for women especially, like, there's a little bit of that's considered soft because it's not mainstream porn, nobody's being trafficked, like nothing's happening, it's all by choice, and it's not real. But what it's doing to you neurologically is still very real. What it's doing to stimulate your body sexually is still very real, even if itself is simulated. And that's the same as for like erotic novels. There's a lot of erotic novels out there right now that again, it's because it's not porn, like Pornhub. It's okay. But what it does is it still feeds that part of your brain that lives on reward system. So like dopamine and oxytocin. Oxytocin being the cuddle hormone, the thing that bonds you to a person in having sex. You then get bonded to what you're watching or what you're reading. And so it changes how you see the world and how you see sex, and changes your framework. It changes your worldview of sexuality. And so people who would never expect to be addicted to porn are suddenly like, well, all I was doing was reading, or all I was doing was watching Bridgerton. But now you are seeking something more and more and more, because that's the nature of addiction, or that's the nature of even sexual perversion, is that once you have started one thing, that kind of stops being enough, and so you go to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and then after a while you're hooked on Pornhub.
I wish more people understood about addiction following any iniquity to pretty low bottoms, is that when oxytocin is released, when you are bonded to a thing or a person, that usually in humans implies that then you become more willing to sacrifice for it, right? So I can say this after birthing 5 children, that massive oxytocin release. I could lift a semi truck with my bare hands for my children. I'm pretty confident that in the right moment I could. And you're bonded to that person, and you see sexual activity in a marriage is very sacred because it continues that bonding experience
And that's
to
how
your
it was
spouse.
created. Why oxytocin works the way that it works is it's designed to bond you in your marriage to your spouse.
Absolutely. And it's amazing how then that same hormone can be used in breastfeeding, it can be used in labor and delivery, in those very physically draining, exhausting, painful few weeks after having a baby. You're given this gift of oxytocin release, right? And it's so necessary, because what you're doing at that point is you're not only forming bonding, you're not only forming attachment through repeated positive interactions and encounters, is you are forming the ability and the willingness to sacrifice greatly for those people. And then it just enlivens scripture, right? That laying down your life for someone, you would do that for your family. The problem is when addiction enters the picture, especially a sexual addiction that has those same hormone releases, and you can say this with even an addiction to opiates or similar substances, is the release happens just the same. The body responds, and you become willing to sacrifice for it. So when we see it, we think it's ridiculous to see this homelessness epidemic, say in places like California, where you're seeing what they call the fentanyl lean, where you're seeing people that are just in the muck, in the mire, in a cesspool of iniquity, and they continue to engage in it daily. Well, why? Because they're willing to sacrifice for that which gives them that same release. And so is the same with pornography. And so is the same with heavy social media use that is instantly gratifying. And so it's so sad because you start to see these real genuine acts of sacrifice totally misdirected. And then I venture to guess one of the sentiments you probably hear very often in your work is that people come up empty.
Oh, yeah, yeah. In the moment, There's euphoria and there is release and there is ecstasy, but then shortly thereafter, there is despair and there's shame and there's guilt and there's, I'll never do it again. Part of the addiction cycle is the going back to the beginning of it. It's all about the wounded self. That's where it starts. And the wounded self triggers shame. And in order to stop shame or stop those icky feelings, you go into the addiction cycle of preoccupation and fantasy, ritual, acting out, and then despair again. And that's the circle of addiction cycle. And so you become in despair at the end of that cycle, but then it's also the beginning of the cycle.
Are there
so it's
signs?
just this cyclical. Go ahead.
Are there signs in kids, adolescents?
It tends to look like secrecy. It tends to look like a lot of alone time, a lot of just, we joke about, boys being in the shower too long, stuff like that. But it's like, but for girls, it's kind of the same thing where you see they're isolating. They're not going out with their friends as much. They're not hanging out with their friends as much. They're not wanting to engage with the family as much. Like anytime you see an addiction, whether you're talking about opioids, but any kind of addiction, if it's a substance or an activity, it becomes the thing that you bond to. And so it becomes the thing that you want to be with more than anyone else or anything else. And we see that with video games and gaming and social media. The more that you engage in these things, the less you engage in real life. So, yeah. And so I would say, as far as parents looking for these kinds of signs, like if they're hanging out in their bedrooms alone a lot, or they're not engaging with the family, they seem disconnected emotionally. These are all things to look at, because there is a thing about pornography that it is traumatic to experience porn, especially as a child. So, like, for example, my first exposure to pornography was not a Playboy centerfold. It was a Penthouse magazine, which was the full sexual experience in image form on the page. So I was seeing male genitalia for the first time. I was seeing penetration for the first time. I was seeing, spread eagle, like everything is in the open for me at 10 years old. And it was extremely traumatic, but also extremely exciting and enticing and intriguing. But when you experience trauma, and trauma doesn't have to be that it was the porn, but anyone that experiences trauma, whether it's the big T traumas, which is like sexual abuse or assault or physical abuse, things like that, or the little T traumas, which are neglect and just not feeling your needs are being taken care of the way they need to be, that point of trauma tends to be the point of emotional, like you get emotionally stuck in that point of trauma. And so if you're 10 years old being exposed to porn, and that's kind of where you stop growing emotionally. And so that's why we see some of these younger people who are traumatized either through an external experience like abuse or through like pornography. They're finding that they are just emotionally disconnected because they are stuck in that trauma cycle. And so that's something else to consider too. Yes, children don't have their frontal cortex. It's not fully developed. They're not making good decisions because of that. Their judgment is nil. I like to say that teenagers especially are undercooked cupcakes. So they look like they're fully baked. You take them out of the oven, they look brown, they look like they're probably okay, but you open them up and they're still gooey, like they're still raw in the middle. And that's what teenagers are. And we tend to treat teenagers like they're young adults, but they're really not, because they're given away far too much freedom for what their brains can handle and what their decision-making abilities are. And so, again, if you're looking for the signs of what your child may look like when they're hooked on porn or using porn, again, it's that disconnection. It's a disconnect emotionally, relationally. And you may even see some aggression from them because they just don't want to connect with you. And it's like that. It looks like angsty teens, but it's more than that. It's especially if the porn they're watching is more violent or of that kind of nature. It's hard to change just how they see and how they treat people as well.
When isolation becomes the norm, when being withdrawn becomes the norm, we shouldn't just say teenagers being teenagers. See, I'm all for the Snoopy mom. That whole like Disney Channel original movie era where it's like, it's my privacy, and the kids get to put rude signs like, keep out. Isolation becomes the norm. And you do hear that though. I've worked with women for 6 years, and every single time I've heard of heavy video game use in partners, without fail, the language that I hear is that of infidelity. 10 out of 10 times when there's heavy video game use, there is an infrastructure built
Mm-hmm.
around this use, very similar to what we see with gambling, where it's not, "We went to the casino together on Saturday night and for a date night, and it was fun." We're not talking that type of behavior. We were talking demanded privacy on a regular cadence that
Mm-hmm.
disrupts the normal family rhythm. So that's what we're looking for. We're not looking for, "I'm gonna go do my homework in my room." We're looking for a refusal to truly engage and be present with the family that's sparked by a marked difference in participation. Parent, they're in this situation, and very unfortunately, what they find out that their child has been exposed to this type of content online. What would you say is the first step must do right away?
You want to be as careful as possible to not approach it with shame, okay? I think one of the most important things is in that first moment is to help connect with them, like emotionally regulation and connection. Children respond best when the adult remains calm and curious and emotionally safe. And so the goal of the first conversation is not panic and punishment, because they are just being children. They are curious. If they haven't had a conversation with you about porn and sex, what do you expect them to do? First of all. And so it's about preserving trust and safety, because children need to know that they're not disgusting, they're not ruined, they're not beyond help, but that you are on their side. And you want to help them to understand what they were looking at, what they saw, and why it wasn't God's best and what God designed it to, sex to be, and why it's not good for them. So I think that's the most important thing, is that you want to keep shame as far away from the conversation as possible while also correcting the behavior.
It's more about putting boundaries in place. So I agree with you where we say, I've always identified more with the term coach than teacher or anything as a mom. That's been so it's an easier framing for me. And so part of coaching, especially a young athlete, is love of the game is so important in that early primary stage, right? And then what you're signing yourself up for when you say, I'm coaching them at the very beginnings of, say, this game or this understanding how to navigate within this arena with integrity, is, like you said, what do you expect them to do if they had no real prior knowledge about how deep this goes, about how difficult it can be, what a slippery slope it is, how consuming it can be, is not to punish them for a crime they perhaps stumbled upon. Usually, that's what we're seeing because of how pervasive it is online. So at first, it's, well, what does a coach have to do? The coach has to understand why the player did what the player did. Cool. So we get to, what made you think that was going to work? Or did you even understand what was happening? Would probably be a great preliminary question. How much unpacking do you do with the kid without aggrandizing the issue?
Well, for me, I think it's this. I mean, this is an interesting conversation, because I feel like we've skipped something, because I think it's critically important that parents have already had a sex conversation up to this point. There's no too early to talk about porn, and there's no too early to talk about sex, at least in terms of age-appropriate conversations. And so, to me, it's about, how do you unpack that with them? Hopefully you can refer back to original conversations that you had about, what is sex supposed to look like? What is sex supposed to be? A man and woman married together, it's intimacy, it's oneness, it's not aggression, it's not perverse, it's not these things that we see in pornography. And so I think that's how you unpack it a little bit, because you want to ask them, like, so what do you think was happening in what you were watching, or what did it make you feel when you saw that? Because oftentimes the answer to that's going to be, it's a little bit scary. It depends on the age, because if you're a teenager, 15, 16, 17 years old, and you've caught your teenager doing these things, unfortunately they probably have seen it earlier than then, and it's not the first time they've seen it. It's not the first time it's just the first time they're being caught with it. But if they're younger than that, then it's certainly one of those conversations where you really want to frame it around, like, how'd that make you feel? Like, what did you think was going on in that scene that you were watching, or that video you saw, or that image you saw? And how did it make you feel? Because oftentimes when they're younger, it's going to be a lot of like, well, it's kind of scary. Like, it was kind of weird. Like, why were they naked? Like, what were they doing with that? Like, what is that thing? Like, all of these things, especially if they're girls, like, they're going to be this much more like curious and just uncomfortable really with what they had seen. When they're older, it's like, well, I know what I saw and what they were doing, and like I'm aware of it. And so I just think it's important that, again, you are avoiding shame, panic. You don't want to make it a catastrophe, because it's not, and you don't want them to feel like they're permanently damaged for having seen this. Shame drives secrecy, and then that secrecy deepens isolation. And so if you approach this conversation with shame and just anger and punishment, then they're never going to come to you when they're struggling again. Like, that's just, why would they come to you? You're not safe in that moment. And so that first conversation should be about protecting connection with your kids, so in the future those conversations remain possible. Because unfortunately, it's likely not the last time they'll see porn. It's the first time they've seen porn, hopefully. But you want to make sure that they feel safe enough to then come talk to you about it again when it happens again. Because more often than not, they didn't seek it out themselves. A friend showed it to them. They were on TikTok and something came up. They were on X, something came up. Even, I remember when I was in, I think it was like 8th or ninth grade, whitehouse.com was a porn site, because that's how they did it back then. They found sites that kids would be
they're like trying to do a book report, and then they
trying to do a book report, and they end up watching porn.
That's nuts.
Because the whitehouse.gov was the actual website at the time. Now they own all derivatives of White House, but at the time, whitehouse.com was a porn site. And so it's like, it's accidental. It is through friends. It is through happenstance. And so it's not something and that's why I say, like, you don't come at it from a punishment and anger. And I know a lot of that comes from fear. And like, a lot of the times anger is like, actually like, you're just sad and you're fearful and you're experiencing all these different things because your kid has now been exposed to something you hope they never would, and so it comes out with anger in kind of an angry way. But if we can dial the temperature down on these conversations, it makes future conversations possible.
What you're describing should give parents so much confidence in how to deal with this too, because you never throw a kid in the river without a life raft. So you never give them increasing freedoms without some exposure to truth, so that they have a comparative analysis should they need it. And so how do you teach them which water's safe to drink? First, give them good, clean water. And then when you take them to the ocean for the first time, if they taste salt, there's a lot of deterrence, right? So they know just from taste that's unpleasant. And then you start to explain to them the difference in water, and you start to explain to them these comparative analyses that are very important to them. It's like with most major things in parenting and in marriage, what do you want to see more of? What you model, what you're willing to model. In the marriage, if you are advertising to your kids what good romance looks like, right? I'm a huge proponent of continuing to go on dates, even if the sitter costs a lot of money and you need to date at home, right? Go put the kids to bed, but let them see dad come home with flowers. Let them see mom make the charcuterie board or whatever it is. And let them see that, model it in front of them. And so what you're describing is it should operate the same with sexuality. So it should operate where, of course, there's a privacy component to that, but there are always going to be layers of life that your kids don't yet see. So what can you model for them? Like you said, don't make isolation the norm in the home. In our house, we just don't have devices in the bedrooms. That's not the norm. We don't walk away with iPads. And so what you're saying,
boundaries with technology is
right, boundaries,
extremely important.
Showing them how to aim up first, so that if there is a pitfall, it is immediately identifiable, that you're not waking up to this situation without having prepared your child at all, because maybe you were too afraid to discuss it. And I know with our kids, because we keep having babies every year, and they're curious. We tell them, well, when you get married, God gives you a special relationship. So that's about an age 4 conversation. And then it matures over time, right? I'm sure as you're kind of instructing parents, and you're kind of like, this is how this matures over time. That first conversation, most important takeaways is this is not about shame. This is about helping you aim up and understanding what you just went through. And then what can we do in the future to protect you and to protect who you want to be? When you talk about talking to kids of different age groups, let's say we're talking about exposure 8 to 12 years old, and then we'll do 13. I know 13 to 17 is quite a range, but we'll just say two different age groups of kids. When you are talking to kids about sexual integrity, you're instructing parents about how to talk to their kids. And you want to talk to these kids early, what type of things would you want them to say without trying kind of stealing their innocence or aggrandizing any sort of sexual language?
Yeah. You don't want to expose them to something that they haven't, that they don't need to be exposed to. And so some of your language matters in terms of all of these things. There's a great series of books called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, written by Kristen Jensen. And she just released one, Good Pictures, Bad Pictures for Girls. And in there, she is really helping you to have these conversations. Like you're reading this book together with your daughter or your son, where you're understanding, like, when these things happen, like, this is what this looks like and this is what this means, and come to me when this happens. But those types of conversations are delicate, and I've never had those conversations because, again, I don't have children. The way you do it without stealing innocence is, again, it's the age appropriateness of it. So I would say if your child is, let's say they're in public school or even private school, like, and you know that they are, I would think I was in 4th grade when we had our first, like, sex talk in school. And so what is 4th grade? Like 9, 8, something like that. And so they're showing me how men's genitalia works. They're showing me how, the vagina works and periods and all of these things. And so that shouldn't be my first understanding of the human body. Shouldn't be from my math teacher, right? It's like, so talking about how young that is, but that's truly, I think, when these conversations are talked about. And of course, we know now, especially in public school, like, Planned Parenthood controls that curriculum. And so you don't want Planned Parenthood teaching your kid about this before you do. And so there is actually some need to steal their innocence a little bit, because someone's going to steal it sooner than later, with the conversations that they're going to be exposed to through friends and through school and through social media and through movies and through X, Y, and Z.
So it's not totally preventing exposure to the conversation that's important.
Yes.
It's about parents getting ahead of the game and being able to shift that trajectory towards a good aim that will land in a healthy
You want to be
place.
the one that shapes the narrative. Like, you want to be the one that shows them. Because if you are a safe parent and you create those good boundaries, then they're going to trust you. Because if you're secretive about sex, then you're not a safe person for them to come to and talk to about it. But if you've already had these conversations about your body, using real language for your body parts, the de-shaming the body, because the body's not bad. Your sexuality isn't bad. God created your sexuality. But he also created it for a purpose and for a time. And so if we can, de-shame all of this language, it goes a long way to preserving innocence and preserving, healthy sexuality going forward. Because we're no longer ashamed about our bodies. We understand our bodies and we understand what they're meant for.
So important for kids to see their parents operating actively in an arena so that they know what moves to use. That they can trust their parents' credibility.
Parents were virgins when they got married, right? So not everybody has had, like, this perfect, shameless, perfect existence, before they got married and even into marriage. You had to figure some things out even in your marriage bed and all of that. Not your kids don't want to hear about mom and dad's sex life, but there is something to be said, like you were talking about, for kids to see that their parents are very much in love, that they care about each other, that they're romantic, that they serve each other, and that relationship is mutual. It's not that one side is, more taken care of than the other side, because that's sort of what the church has gotten wrong over the last several decades. It's been a lot about how the man is served sexually and not the wife. But Paul talks about, husband, you are responsible for the sexual needs of your wife, and wives, you're responsible for the sexual needs of your husbands. That means that the sexual relationship in marriage is mutual, and it's about giving and not receiving.
If you go into the translation of Paul's instructions in the Greek, there are many terms that could have been used if Paul really meant the husband's headship to be truly hierarchical.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, there's some argument that Paul's terminology in the Greek was aimed more at viewing the husband as a source of provision, a source of care, a source of, yes, leadership. But as we know, true leadership, it's often servant leadership. It's often being brought low to lift others up. It's often being willing to do the important work of, one of our favorite quotes is the man in the arena, right? I think it was Roosevelt, and about the man as someone who is willing to put devotion and hard work and study on display for his family on a daily basis, and then to deliver the fruits of that to the family, that is what provision means biblically. So that would really alter the understanding of many Christians when we're looking at marriage, and especially when we're looking at the sexual relationship, and how women do not have to live under a forgotten category when it comes to intimacy in a marriage. And so that can be very difficult to rectify in a marriage when it is so heavily reinforced. This is a hierarchical relationship, and that the women should almost have very minimal, if any, vested interest in sexual satisfaction in the marriage.
Right. And that speaks to, especially within the church, just how isolated women feel when they are addicted to porn and sex and sexuality. Because they feel like there's something wrong with them because the church as a whole is telling them you shouldn't even be sexual. You shouldn't want it, you shouldn't experience it. This is weird for you to even be talking about. And so that's where that shame again just compounds, because not only do they feel alone in their struggle just in general, but now they're told you shouldn't even like this. And there's no basis biblically for that anyway.
Both were given the garden. Both were brought to Eden.
Why do we have our anatomy? Why are we able to achieve an orgasm if we're not going to like it? It just doesn't make any sense to me.
And there are some cultures that remove that from the woman. And what blasphemy is that? To remove that ability from women, and then to call on the name of a God to substantiate that claim. And so we don't want to do a version of that to women in any culture, even if we're not physically mutilating women. You don't want to relationally mutilate them either when it comes to the sexual relationship. It's deeply unloving, and then you're not being used as a resource for your wife. You're not being used to provide the relationship with something that's also very vital to her. I want to talk about a bit about the resources you provide at She Recovery. What's your method now for helping families, marriages, maybe even parents with overcoming any sort of sexual integrity issues in their marriage? What's your main service that you like to provide?
Well, we have a lot of different services, but obviously our primary is to the woman who is struggling. So, like I said at the very beginning of our conversation, we're one of the only, if not the only, organization that just serves the woman who is struggling. But when you serve her, you are serving her family, you are serving her marriage, you are serving her future marriage, you are serving, all of her and what she's going to be experiencing in her life. And so what that looks like at our organization is we have virtual meetings every day of the week. They're virtual, so they're online. We have chat groups. Basically, it's all about helping them to find community that makes them feel seen and known, that they're not alone in what they're struggling with, that isolation feeds addiction, and so we really want to help them to find the community that is like them. They can see themselves in that community. But it requires more than just checking in and talking on Zoom. So we offer coaching, counseling, as well as spiritual care services, also virtual. And that's where I really feel like is the digging deeper aspect of what we do. I like to say we have like a toes in, a waist deep, and an all in approach to what we do. And so the toes in is kind of the like our Facebook community, our social media accounts, like this the awareness of like stepping into recovery. 90 Days to Wholeness is our recovery devotional. It's totally for free on the YouVersion Bible app. It's 90 days of recovery devotionals. It's also available as a workbook on Amazon. And again, that's like those tangible steps you can take to begin your recovery journey. And then the waist deep would be those meetings. Like you're starting to jump into community. You're jumping into something that you never expected you would actually be able to find or do or have the courage to do. And so you're waist deep. And then the all in is then those deeper works, the coaching and the counseling, the spiritual care. Because at that point, we're not just talking about behavior management, we're talking about that wholeness of self. So the body, mind, and spirit wholeness of actually growing, not sobriety, but healing. And then from there, we have other resources. From time to time, I do some parental trainings about social media, about technology. You mentioned before about, I don't believe in privacy. Like parents, there's no privacy there's a meme that's like, I deserve privacy. And it's like, you came from my privacy, And so but that's like, that's the reality, right? It's like I made you or I provide everything for you. And so whatever you have, your phone, your computer, your bedroom, like this is my stuff. Like I get to see all of it. And I really try to empower parents with that, where it's like you can sneak, you don't have to sneak, you can actually just walk in and be like, I'm gonna look at your phone, give me your phone, You should know their passwords. You should know their combinations on their phones. Like there should be no secrets between parents and children. Because again, you made them, you own them until they leave the house, and even then there's some letting go that has to happen. And so I like to do those kind of trainings as well. And then if someone's interested in helping women like these women, like we also do trainings on coaching, on how to coach women in these areas. And we also have a virtual conference that's actually going to be taking place this fall. It's also entirely online. It's all free, but it's a way for women who are struggling. We're going to have some sessions for parents to how just the awareness, like helping to have those conversations with your kids, and then also have sessions for the helper, the person who wants to help this demographic.
Thank you so much for your time, Crystal. I really appreciate you walking through how to handle these issues as a family, in marriage, and in parenting, and just as a woman who may come from a place of struggling and who wants to seek that wholeness that maybe has been compromised, that it can be regained. Where can listeners find you if they want to learn more?
The easiest way to connect with us is our main website at sherecovery.com. It's she as in the pronoun for women, sherecovery.com. There you can find out all of our resources, all the different ways to connect with us, including our conference this fall.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Crystal. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
On Rebranding Motherhood, we talk about the lie that motherhood is a trap, and that if you are in a situation where you need support, then no one will be there to help you or to be a steady voice for you. I want to talk to you about our Project Loveline that decimates that lie and helps women get real help in real time. We connect women with resources, or if we can't find one, we become the resource. So if you, someone you know, needs to access our hotline, you can visit us at loveline.com. And if you want to volunteer, if you want to be that steady voice in someone's life, we would love to talk to you about your heart for helping mothers. Thank you.